The first words Junia Marsh ever heard in my valley were a man laughing at her, and I have spent the better part of 50 years trying to make up for the fact that I was standing close enough to hear them. Del Pryor had sent away for a bride the same way he sent away for a new harrow, by catalog, sight unseen, expecting the thing to arrive looking like the picture promised. What stepped down off the noon train at Caudle's Mill that April was a woman with a burned scar drawn pale and smooth across her left cheek, and a back so straight you'd have thought the Lord set a fence post in her spine. Pryor took one look. Then he said, loud enough for the whole platform to hear, that he'd not been cheated this bad since a horse trader sold him a blind mule and called it broke to saddle. I was 31 that year, and I'd told myself a long time ago that other folks' business was none of mine. I had 100 head on Cane Creek, and a house I'd built with my own hands and not one single soul in it, and that was the way I'd arranged my life on purpose. I had come into the Pine Water as a boy with frostbit feet and no name worth saying, and the valley had taken me in when it had no cause to, and I'd paid that back the only way I knew how, which was to mind my work and keep to myself and never ask a thing of anybody. So I stood there by the freight scale with a coil of rope over my shoulder, and I meant to load my wire and go home. But I watched her face when Pryor said it. She didn't flinch. That was the thing that caught me. A woman gets laughed at in front of a whole town. The natural thing is to crumble, or to flush red, or to put a hand up over the marked side of her face the way I'd seen marked folks do all my life. She did none of it. She set her carpetbag down on the boards, real careful, like it had something breakable in it, and she looked Del Pryor up and down the way you'd look at a fence you were deciding whether to lean on, and she said, "Then we are agreed, Mr. Pryor, that you and I would not have suited." That shut the platform up for half a second. Then somebody laughed again, at Pryor this time, and Pryor went the color of a brick, and that made it worse, because there is nothing on God's earth meaner than a proud man made to look small in front of his neighbors. He stepped up close to her, and he told her she could climb right back on that train, that he wasn't paying her fare back east, that she'd come under false colors, and he hoped she was ashamed. She was not ashamed. I could see that plain. But I could also see that her hands had started to shake, just a little, down at her sides where she thought nobody was looking, and I understood that she had nowhere to go. The train was already taking on water for the run back to the junction. She had a carpetbag and a wooden trunk and not, I'd have wagered, $2 to her name, and a face the whole territory was going to talk about by supper. I knew that cold. I knew it the way you know an old break in a bone. It doesn't hurt every day, but you never forget which arm. When I was 9 years old, a wagon train left me at a way station because I had a fever they were afraid of, and every grown person in that station looked at me the exact way Caudle's Mill was looking at Junia Marsh, like I was a problem that had been handed to them by mistake, and the kindest thing would be for me to disappear. So I did the thing I had spent 20 years promising myself I would never do, which was to walk into something that wasn't mine. I crossed the platform and I picked up her trunk and set it on my shoulder, and the whole town watched me do it, and I said, "Ma'am, the eastbound doesn't leave till morning, and there's no call for you to sit on a depot bench all night. There's a clean room at Hetty Vane's boarding house, and I'll stand the cost of it. No strings on that. You can take the train home tomorrow with a full belly and a night's sleep behind you, and that's the whole of the offer." She looked at me a long moment. Up close, the scar wasn't the first thing about her at all. The first thing was her eyes, which were a steady gray and were taking my measure the same as she'd taken Pryor's, and finding me about as trustworthy, which I'll allow was fair. "And what is the cost to me of your charity, Mr. Mercer, Gideon Mercer?" "No cost. I've had a night I needed a bed and didn't have the price of one. I'm square with the world on that account, and I'd like to stay square." Pryor wasn't done. He never was, that man. He said something then about a man buying his leavings, and I set the trunk back down nice and slow, and I looked at him until he found something else to look at, which didn't take long, because for all his bluster Del Pryor had never in his life done a day's work that left a callus, and he knew which of us would still be standing if it came to it. I am not proud of leaning on a man's fear, but I am not sorry either. I carried her trunk up the hill to Hetty Vane's, and she walked beside me the whole way with her chin level, and the town watched us go, and that was the start of it, though neither of us knew it yet. I'll tell you the thing I didn't say on the platform, because it's the whole of why any of this happened. I knew her name before she ever stepped off that train. Pryor was a man who couldn't hold his liquor or his secrets, and the week before, down at the Mills One saloon, he'd been crowing about the bride coming out from a town back in Indiana. A schoolteacher, he'd said, must be desperate, a spinster taking what she could get, and he'd read out part of her letter to the men at the bar for a laugh. I'd been at the far end with a coffee, minding my own, the way I did. And the part he read to make them laugh was the part where she'd written, plain and without any begging in it, that she would tell him the truth before she came so he could not say later he'd been deceived. That 2 years back the schoolhouse where she taught had caught fire from a bad stovepipe in the night while the children were inside at a winter recital, and that she had gone back in for them 3 times, and that the 3rd time the roof beam came down, and that she had a burn that some found hard to look at, and that if that disqualified her in his eyes, he should write and say so and keep his honor and her time both. The men at the bar had laughed at desperate and spinster, and at the picture of a marked-up woman, thinking any man would want her. I had not laughed. I had sat there with my coffee going cold and thought about a woman walking back into a burning building 3 times for children that weren't even hers, and I had thought, that is the bravest thing I have heard tell of in this valley in 20 years, and these fools are laughing at her face. So when she stepped off that train and Pryor turned her out, I wasn't a stranger acting on a stranger's kindness. I knew exactly what they were laughing at, and I knew it was a hero. And something in me, that I'd kept good and quiet for a long time, stood up and would not sit back down. I didn't tell her that. A man tells a woman he knows her business and read her letter, she's right to think the worse of him. I just carried the trunk. She didn't take the morning train. I found that out from Hetty Vane, who came out to the Mercer place 2 days later under the excuse of selling me eggs, which she had never once done before in her life, and who got around to her real errand the way Hetty got around to everything, sideways. The Indiana woman, she said, had paid for her own room the 2nd night with money sewn into her hem, wouldn't take the free one past the 1st, and had walked down to the schoolhouse that nobody had used in 3 years, since the last teacher married and left, and the valley got too poor and too proud to send for another, and she'd stood in front of it a long while, and then she'd come back and asked Hetty who in the mill she'd see about the school. "And what'd you tell her?" I asked. "Told her the school boards 3 men and one of them's Del Pryor." Hetty sniffed. She didn't so much as blink, said she'd write to all 3. Then Hetty looked at me sideways again. "You going to tell me, Gideon Mercer, why a man who hasn't spoke 100 words in this town in 10 years carried that woman's trunk up my hill in front of God and everybody?" "She had a trunk and I had a shoulder," I said, and gave her 2 bits too many for the eggs to get her gone. But I rode into the mill that Saturday, which I never did, and I went by the schoolhouse, which I'd never had cause to. The door was open. She was inside on her knees with her sleeves rolled and a bucket of gray water beside her, scrubbing 3 years of mouse dirt and bird mess off the floorboards, and she'd already got the windows clean enough to let the light in, and she'd stacked the broken benches in a corner and set the sound ones in rows. She had a smudge of ash across the unmarked side of her face, and she was singing something low to herself, and she looked, I'll be honest with you, more at home in that wreck of a building than Del Pryor had ever looked in his whole fine house. I stood in the doorway a while before she knew I was there. When she did, she sat back on her heels and looked at me, wary, and I felt like a fool, a grown man filling up a child's doorway with no notion of what he'd come to say. "The board hasn't hired you," I said. "It came out wrong like an accusation." "No," she agreed. Two of them haven't answered, and Mr. Pryor answered to say the valley has no money for a teacher and no children worth schooling. She wrung out her rag. He's wrong on the second count. I counted 14 children between here and the river who can't read their own names. The money I'll grant him. So I'm cleaning it for free, and I'll teach it for whatever the families can spare in eggs and meal. And when the board sees 14 children reading, they can decide whether that's worth a wage or not. That's a hard way to live. I've had harder. She said it without any drama, just a fact, and went back to her scrubbing. Then, not looking up, "Why did you come, Mr. Mercer?" I didn't have an answer ready, so I gave her the truth, which is a thing I was out of practice at. I don't rightly know. I've been telling myself for 2 days it was none of my business what happened to you, and I find I can't make myself believe it. She stopped scrubbing. She looked at me for a good long while, and the wariness in her gray eyes didn't go away exactly, but it shifted, like she was setting it down to pick up something else and look at it. "There's a second bucket and a second rag," she said. So I got down on my knees on that filthy floor in my good Saturday clothes, and the two of us scrubbed a schoolhouse clean, and we didn't talk much, and it was the best afternoon I'd had in more years than I want to put a number to. The valley did not make it easy on her, and it did not make it easy on me. The mill ran on Pryor's say-so more than anybody liked to admit, because Pryor held paper on half the farms in the Pinewater. He'd lent against bad years, and he called the notes in his head and let men know it. And so when Dell Pryor decided that the scarred schoolteacher was a swindle and the man who'd carried her trunk was a fool, a good many people who knew better decided it was easier to agree with him out loud. They didn't send their children at first. They crossed the street. Hetty Vane caught a cold shoulder for renting Junia a room. The talk about my interest in her ran from one end of the valley to the other and back, and most of it was ugly, and some of it I deserved, because I will not pretend my interest was pure as creek water by then. It wasn't. But here is what I learned about Junia Marsh that spring watching her. She did not fight the valley. She outweighted it. She opened her school with 4 children, the 4 poorest, whose folks had nothing to lose by crossing Pryor and everything to gain from a child who could cipher. By June she had 9, because the first 4 came home reading, and a child reading at the supper table to a mother who never could is a thing no amount of Dell Pryor's disapproval will stand against. By the end of summer she had 13 of the 14, the holdout being Pryor's own nephew, and she taught them in a building she'd cleaned with her own hands, paid in eggs and side meat, and one memorable week a live goose. And she never once let me give her $1, though the Lord knows I tried. I found reasons to be in the mill on Saturdays. I bring a wagon load of stove wood and stack it by the schoolhouse without asking. I mended the bell yoke. I put a new ridgepole on the roof when the old one started to bow, and when she came out and stood with her arms crossed and said she could not pay me for it, I said the valley had given me a roof once when I couldn't pay for it either, and I was passing it along, and that seemed to settle something in her, because she didn't argue the roof after that. We got to talking on those Saturdays. Real talking, the kind I hadn't done with another person in my whole grown life. She told me about Indiana, about the children she'd taught and the ones she'd lost track of, about the fire. She told me about the fire plainly, the way she did everything, and she told me the part Pryor had laughed at, about going back in 3 times, and she told me the part Pryor hadn't read out loud, which was that all the children lived. Everyone. The scar was the price, and she told me she would pay it again twice over and not think hard about it. She said her own town had been kind for about a month, and then had started to look at her sideways, the way you look at a thing that reminds you of a fire you'd rather forget, and that a marked woman in a small town becomes a kind of ghost, present but not quite counted. And that one morning she'd seen the catalog of brides at the dry goods store, and thought she'd rather be a stranger somewhere new than a ghost somewhere old. "And here you are a stranger," I said. "Here I am a stranger," she agreed, "but the children look me right in the face, Mr. Mercer. Children don't have the trick of looking away yet. It's the kindest thing about them." She touched the scar, The only time I ever saw her do it, not to hide it but just to find it, the way you'd touch a thing to be sure it was still there. I'd about forgot what it was to be looked at straight. I looked at her straight then, I couldn't help it. "You're doing it now," she said, and there was the first small smile I'd ever got off her, just a flicker of one, and I tell you my heart turned over in my chest like a green colt. It was the river that turned the valley, in the end, though I'd give a good deal to have spared her what it cost. We had a wet August, the wettest in years, and the pine water came up over its low banks one Tuesday while the school was in session. The schoolhouse sat on a rise, so it was safe enough, but the Dawkins place was down in the bottom by the ford, and the Dawkins girl, a little thing of 6 named Pearl, the youngest of Junia's 13, had been kept home that day with a cough. When the water came up sudden in the afternoon, the way snowmelt water does, the Dawkins cabin took it to the windowsills, and her mother got the older children up onto the woodshed roof but couldn't reach Pearl, who'd been put to nap in the loft and was too scared to climb down to the rising water. Junia heard the bell. Old Dawkins was ringing the schoolhouse bell. She'd had me hang it back true to raise the valley, and she was out the door before half the fathers in the mill had their boots on. By the time I got down there from Cane Creek with my horse and a rope, she was already in the water. I have thought about that day every year of my life since. I will tell it to you straight the way she'd want it told, without making it bigger than it was, because she hated a thing made bigger than it was. She'd waded out to the cabin with a coil of clothesline tied around her waist, and the other end held by 2 of the Dawkins boys on the woodshed. The water was brown and fast and full of fence rails and a drowned shote, and everything else the river had picked up, and it was at her chest by the door. She couldn't have known, going in, whether the loft floor would hold or the current would take her off her feet. She went anyway. A woman who'd been into fire 3 times was not going to be stopped by water once. I got there as she came back out the cabin door with Pearl Dawkins on her hip, and the child's arms locked around her neck so tight you couldn't have pried them loose with a bar. The clothesline had fouled on something and the boys couldn't draw it, and Junia was fighting the current with one arm and holding a child with the other and losing ground, and I put my horse into the water and got the rope to her, and we hauled them both up onto the rise, soaked and shaking, and Pearl Dawkins screaming the good healthy scream of a child who is going to be entirely fine, which is the best sound in the world. The whole valley saw it. That was the thing. Half of Caudle's mill was on that bank by then, and they all saw the scarred schoolteacher they'd been crossing the street to avoid go into a flooded river for a child that wasn't hers, and not the first soul of them had moved fast enough to do it themselves. They saw it the way I'd heard about the fire, the same woman, the exact same woman, the scar and the courage being the one thing and not 2. There was a long quiet on that bank, the kind a valley falls into when it's ashamed of itself and hasn't worked out yet how to say so. And then Pearl Dawkins' mother, who had not once sent so much as an egg to that school and had said hard things about its teacher in the mill, walked up to Junia where she stood dripping with her hair come down and her dress ruined, and she didn't say a word. She just took Junia's hand in both of hers and held it against her own face and wept. And that, more than the river, more than anything I ever did, is what turned the pine water. Not pity. They'd had pity for her, the cheap, useless kind, the whole time. What she earned on that riverbank was respect, and respect, once a valley gives it, it does not easily take back. Del Pryor took it back, or tried to. He couldn't abide it. He'd staked his pride on her being a cheat and a fraud, and now the whole valley was carrying eggs and cordwood up to her school again, and tipping their hats to her on the street, and a man like Pryor would rather burn his own house down than be proved small in public twice. So he found his ground where men like him always find it, which is on the only field where they're brave, which is words. It came to a head at the harvest social, in the autumn, in the mill's meeting hall with the whole valley packed in. The school board was to vote that night, finally, on whether to pay Junia Marsh a teacher's wage out of the county fund, a wage she'd more than earned, with 13 children reading where there'd been none, And Pryor stood up before the vote with that oily ease of his and made a speech. He didn't attack her courage. Even Pryor wasn't fool enough to do that, not after the river. He attacked her the clever way. He stood up in front of God and the valley, and he said it was a shame, a real shame, what folks would overlook in a person on account of a sad story, and that he for one thought the children of the Pinewater deserved a teacher who could stand in front of them without the little ones having nightmares of her face, and that he'd heard, he said. In that way a man says a lie he once believed, that the Mercer place and the schoolteacher had an arrangement that wasn't fit to be schooling Christian children. And that maybe before the board paid out good money it ought to ask what exactly a never-married rancher was doing hauling wood to a never-married woman's door every Saturday. It got quiet, mean quiet. He put two ugly things in the air, her face and her name, and tied them together, and he'd done it the coward's way with I've heard and I'd think, so he could never be made to answer for any of it straight. I was on my feet before I knew it. I had a hot thing in my chest, a thing I'd carried since I was a boy at a way station, and I'd have crossed that room and broke Del Pryor's nose in front of the whole valley, and I'd have felt fine about it, and it would have proved every word he said. But Junia caught my sleeve. She stood up from the bench beside me. We did sit beside each other by then, I won't pretend otherwise, and she gave my sleeve one small tug, not to pull me back exactly, but to say, "Not for me and not like that." And then she stepped out into the open floor of that hall, alone. By her own choosing, and she faced Del Pryor, and she did not raise her voice. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "you've named two things. You've named my face and you've named my honor, and you've done it the way a man does who hopes nobody will ask him to stand behind it. So I'll stand behind it for you." She turned slow, so the whole room got a clear look at the scarred side of her face, the side she'd never once hidden in this valley. "This is what it cost me to carry 7 children out of a fire. I would pay it again tonight. If a child of yours has a nightmare of my face, Mr. Pryor, you send them to me, and I will tell them how I came by it, and they will not be afraid of it after, because there is nothing in a scar to be afraid of, only in the fire, and I have never once in my life run from the fire." You could have heard a pin drop. "As to my honor," she said, and now she looked not at Pryor but around at the whole valley, every face of it, "I have lived in your sight for 6 months. You have watched everything I have done. You do not need Mr. Pryor to tell you what kind of woman I am. You've seen it. And as to Gideon Mercer—" And here she stopped, and she looked back at me, where I stood half up out of my seat with my fists still closed, and something in her face changed, and I understood that she'd come to a decision somewhere in the middle of her own speech, the way you come over a rise and see the whole country at once. "As to Gideon Mercer," she said to the room but with her eyes on me, "he has hauled wood to my door and mended my bell and put a roof over my school, and never once asked a thing of me for any of it, and never once looked away from my face, not one time, not even the first day on that platform when the rest of you found it so amusing. So if his name is to be tied to mine in this valley's talk, Mr. Pryor, then let it be tied honest, in church, with a ring." She lifted her chin that way she had. "If he'll have me, I have not asked him. I'm asking him now in front of all of you, so there will be no whispering about it after. Mr. Mercer, will you have me? I have been asked, by my grandchildren and by a newspaper man who came through once wanting the story, how it felt. A woman asking a man to marry her in front of a whole valley, which was not the way things were done. And the truth is I felt nothing in that moment that I have words for. I came around the bench and I crossed that floor, and I wanted understood that I came to stand beside her, level with her, not in front of her, because she had not needed a single soul to stand in front of her in her whole life, and I was not about to insult her by starting now. And I took her hand, the way I'd wanted to since April, and I found my voice from somewhere. "Junia Marsh," I said, "I came into this valley a half-froze orphan that nobody wanted, and it took me in, and I have spent 20 years trying to be worth the taking. The day they laughed at you on that platform was the day I quit being grateful to this valley and started loving it, because I knew it had it in it to do better, and you've gone and made it do better, every soul of it, by being braver than the lot of us put together. My voice went rough then, and I let it. I'd have you. I'd have had you in April. I just hadn't the sense to know a man's allowed to want a thing he doesn't deserve. The valley came up off its benches. Not for me, for her mostly, and I was glad of it. Pearl Dawkins' mother started it, the cheering, and then it was the whole hall, and somewhere in it the board voted Junia her wage by acclamation without anybody bothering to count. And Del Pryor sat down in the middle of all of it with nobody looking at him at all, which for a man like Pryor is the only true punishment there is. We were married in the Mills little church 3 weeks later, with the whole valley in the pews, and Pearl Dawkins carried the flowers, and I will say no more about the rest of that day, except that it was the first day of the only home I ever truly had. I am an old man now, and Junia is gone 4 years, and I find I can't ride down to the mill any more without one of the grandchildren driving me, which I grumble about so they won't see how much I need it. But I had her for 41 years, and I'll tell you what I got. She taught school in the Pinewater for 30 of those years, in a building the valley rebuilt twice as big after the children outgrew it, and there is not a soul under 50 in this whole country who can read who didn't learn it from her, and some of them are doctors now, and one is a judge, and Pearl Dawkins' own daughter teaches in that same school today. We had children of our own, 3 that lived, and a passel of grandchildren, and every one of them grew up climbing on a grandmother whose face had a scar on it, and not one of them was ever afraid of it for a single minute, because she'd been right about that children look you straight, and they only learn to look away when grown fools teach them to. Del Pryor lost his paper and his standing inside of a few years, the way that kind of man generally does once a community decides it's done being run by its meanest member, and he left the valley, and I'm told he died somewhere else, and I find I can't summon up much about him at all anymore, which Junia always said was the proper end for him, not hatred, just forgetting. Folks ask me sometimes, the newspaper man asked me, whether the scar ever bothered me, married to it all those years. And the honest answer, the one I never gave the newspaper man because it was nobody's business but ours, is that I stopped seeing it so early I can't tell you when. There came a day, somewhere in that first year, when I looked at my wife across the supper table and I realized I'd forgot which cheek it was on, and I had to think about it, and I never could get it back to where I noticed it after that. The valley had laughed at her face. The valley had been blind. The thing about that scar was never what it looked like. It was what it meant, which was that here stood a woman who would go into the fire for you and come back out carrying what mattered. And once you understood that about a person, you'd no more call it a flaw than you'd call the calluses on a working man's hands a flaw. She came off that train a stranger the whole town laughed at, and she made this town her own, and she made me her own, and the last thing she ever said to me, I'll keep most of it for myself, but I'll give you this part, was that she'd been right, that morning in Indiana, to choose to be a stranger somewhere new rather than a ghost somewhere old. Only I didn't stay a stranger long, did I, Gideon? She said. No, I told her. You did not. You stayed about a week, and then you were the heart of the Pinewater, and you have been ever since, and you will be long after they've planted me beside you. And that's the whole of it. A man can ride past most things in this world and tell himself they're none of his business, and be right about nearly all of them. But every now and again, there's a thing on the platform you cannot ride past without losing the part of yourself worth keeping. I picked up a trunk. That's all I did that first day. I want that understood. The rest of it she did herself, every bit, in front of a valley that didn't deserve her until she taught it how to be deserving. I only had the sense to stand beside her while she did.